and broke it. And then I couldn't get into VLE or anything because I couldn't duo. I couldn't duo. And then I couldn't remember my Apple ID, so I couldn't log back in. And I knew it was a whole thing, so I didn't get back in until like the 5th of January. And then I was like, I have like a philosophy essay to write for one or 2 exams. Didn't do any work during the semester.
Macros. The 2 days before finals. My worst result. I always did bad on the coursework. I always felt bad about that as well. But I think it was my thesis was the only one as well. It's good to know. It's not very much, is it? Absolutely very good job. Like the masters anyway. You're wasting your prayers. Pray for something better.
I'm not to like. It's the 20th of April.
I know. There's still places that I've checked you around.
Just do an off-cycle internship.
Yeah. I could do that. That's true. But when I looked at one of them that was hiring, they said you had to be already on course for a master's next year. And I hadn't applied to that. So
No, you just tell them.
You just tell them.
yeah.
Because they won't ask. If you get it, they won't ask for the proof that you are until you've got it. They're not going to go through the documents for everyone's masters like in the application process. They're only going to check when they offer you it.
I was at this position, interest rate on hold for about 2 months, and then I'll get back to you on the
Well, no, the
confirmation.
application process will take about a
Yeah.
month, won't it?
That's why you apply for some places.
Yeah.
And then you can justify your masters to your parents. Say, look, if I get a master's, because they're asking for it for a reason, right? If you're on track to get a master's, and they're asking for an internship, then they're looking for someone higher, realistically.
I was like, internships are a lot less appealing.
It's possible, yeah.
But then again, this could be written, but then again, doing masters and an offsite at the same time.
It's doable.
It's doable.
It's probably well.
Easy.
You just have to have an open.
Yeah, your social life. Your
That's
friends
my
are
plan for a master. It's my plan for a master anyway.
social
No,
life.
yeah.
You don't have food to smoke.
All my whole mindset is I will master.
Yeah, and then they will go home and realize they're all anonymous. When she graduated, a lot of her friends. It's a shock to the system. Lots of scary. I don't have my pen out. That's okay. Yep.
That'd be a
Yeah.
Questions before we start? Anything that you'd like to ask? There was a tiny bit on the locus model that I did not manage to mention in class as such, but that's there in the handout. You can read it. It's on the locus critique, etc. I don't know if you know about these things, but it's an illustration of the locus critique within the model. All the literature that's quite important in the 70s. It's still relevant. I'm not going to talk about that today. The module survey is open. I don't think I need to do anything about it. So you are encouraged to let it, please, with any comments, etc. that you have. And very few people in class, and yet it's useful to do that. So please do that when you can. You have some time. And if I have some time in one of the practical classes, I'll leave some time spared so that you can actually fill in the survey. First, I want to cover the material. Any questions? Anything that you want to ask? Okay. So what we want to do today, and in fact in the remaining lectures, 3 of them that we have this week, is talk about an aspect of macro and monetary economics, which is very important, and that's banking. But in a very specific manner. There are lots of detailed institutional details in banking that are extremely important as to how the system works. That's not what's of concern to us. Not because it's not relevant, but because I want to focus on essentially two papers that deal with 2 different issues. One is, why do we see banks? What is it that banks, what is the role of banks in the economy? Without really thinking about the larger macroeconomy. So one aspect is that. And why do we have bank runs, which we will do tomorrow and Thursday. So in terms of why do we see banks, this is both of these papers I had said last week are by Douglas Diamond. The second one, they're both very important. This is not, because it's not Peter Diamond, Douglas Diamond. And both these papers originate in his doctoral thesis at Yale. And then after he graduated, he moved to Chicago, he's been there forever, he's won the Nobel Prize, all sorts of things. As I said last week, do not convince yourself that you've understood things by reading anything that he writes where he gives lectures on these things. He presents some very simple frameworks to try and explain what's happening. I've always found it much more confusing than anything else. Do not also try to read the original paper on what we will cover today. What we will cover tomorrow, for that you are required to read the paper. But what we cover today, the paper is actually quite well structured, but it can be done in a simpler framework. And that's what we will be doing in class. Okay? So the idea is the following, that when you think about the most basic kinds of financial assets, the ones that we've dealt with so far, they're traded on markets. So you think about corporate bonds or shares in companies, every unit looks exactly the same as every other unit. And therefore, they can be traded anonymously on the market. Okay, the fact that you own a few shares makes you no different from somebody else who owns a few other shares. So what you're entitled to is exactly the same. Okay, so they're traded anonymously. This is important. So it is a type of contract, but those contracts are standardized contracts and they trade in a completely anonymous manner. However, when you think about savers and what happens with their savings, things are a bit different, because when you save, you realize that there are others in the economy who would like to use your savings to generate a higher return. Okay? The only problem is that the person who's borrowing probably has much better information about how they're going to utilize those funds. So there is an asymmetry of information. Okay, that's the key problem. They would of course want you to lend to them at mutually convenient rates, but what is a mutually convenient rate when the other side has better information than you? So there are two things here. Before you lend, you obviously want to get more information about how you will verify what the return is. Whether you could do it yourself, that might be costly. Or you could do it through an intermediary, which in this case would be the bank. Because that's basically what banks do. And traditionally, banks have done money lenders, banks, modern name is banks, everybody are called money lenders. There are other things that they did, but fundamentally they played a role of intermediation. So they were the go-between the savers and the borrowers. Okay? And the reason for that, that Diamond proposes, and it's a very reasonable reason, is that there is an asymmetry of information, and banks in some ways will be better, because of the technology involved, at monitoring borrowers. But that can't be the end of the story. After all, if the bank has access to the technology that allows it to tell you what's been happening, then the question is, why would it be truthful with you? Okay? So the bank knows that the firm's output is such and such. Why should it not come back and lie to you and say, you know, all these firms failed, so you're not getting your money back? Right. So that's the key question that Diamond tackles. And he says that you can use a particular kind of contract, which is fairly standard, and you can use those contracts to justify why you would still use banks, under what conditions. And in doing so, it's actually not a very satisfactory solution. He will give you a solution, or we'll see what the solution is, and the solution essentially requires something which in some sense is not quite within the model. That's what makes this, in some ways, interesting. Okay? So, it's a model of so-called delegated monitoring. It will be less costly for the bank to monitor. There will be a separate mechanism to make sure that banks are being truthful, and we essentially wish to analyze this entire model and show under what conditions you will get this sort of financial intermediation, and argue that you get it under reasonable conditions, subject to the caveat that there is an element in that contract that if you wish to take seriously, you basically need to think about reputational effects, which basically means you need to think about longer-term interactions, which are things that are not in the law. Right? This is a bit of a problem with the law that it's done in economics and finance. Sometimes in economics, either if you do economics the way you've seen it in this class, we try and make sure that you close all the loopholes, but then you're limited in how much the model can do. Or you accept some loopholes, you're able to explain a little more, but you're left a bit dissatisfied. Which is going to be the case with this model that we studied today. Right. So the model has n firms which are identical. I'm not writing everything on the board because you do have all the stuff in your notes. There is also a little bit of reading. The original paper has not been listed, but you can find it if anyone is interested. But the way the contracting problem is set out in that paper is because of the notation is a bit difficult to follow. It was also the case that there was a lot of research done on that specific kind of contracting problem in the late 70s. So it was very recent. I think if that were to be written now by perhaps somebody else, it would be written in a much more clear fashion. So it's a bit difficult to follow. But you can still, if you find it sufficiently interesting, you can always, when you have a bit of time, not now, you do exams and things, but if you wish to, you can always download that paper and look at it later. So it's n firms, they're all identical. It's a very simple structure in terms of the micros, much more what you might have seen in game theory or industrial organization. So n identical firms, each has a project. Which requires one as investment, one unit of the good, okay, and returns y twiddle, which is random, IID, so it's drawn from the same distribution independently for all of the firms together. Okay, so these are IID returns. The distribution, of course, is known and observable only to the firm. This only, of course, will change. Can be observed only by the firm. Okay, so there is an asymmetry of information. Now, I've named this model hazard. When we speak about model hazard, we typically refer to situations where there is an action that someone takes and you don't know what action has been taken. Okay, while adverse selection refers to situations where the person has an informational advantage. Although there is no action that's taken here by the firm, we will still refer to this as model hazard. I remember many years back, Eric Maskin, who also a Nobel Prize winner, giving lectures on asymmetric information, and there was a student in the audience who asked, why are you calling this such and such instead of the other? And he said, well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. With asymmetric information, how we model it is the important thing. Okay? Moral hazard is a term that's often used in the insurance literature And by which I mean actually the people who figure out, actuaries, etc. They use the term model level. So K is the cost of monitoring. So there is a technology which you can use. If you pay K units, that technology will reveal the exact value of Y for one specific firm. Each time you use it, you have to pay K. Okay? So the K is the cost of monitoring, which is perfect. So it perfectly reveals the value of Y tilde for that firm. You have N times N lenders, each with, as you might guess, 1 over M, each with 1 over M units of the goods. Each. Okay? Which basically means that with M larger than 1, you need more than one lender to finance a firm. This is the key point. Lenders are small here relative to the size of the project and therefore the size of the firm. You will also need many firms. You can see why. And this is partial equilibrium, so R is the interest rate, so the return from a riskless equity. Think about government bonds, gilts, something along those lines. So there is a return that you can always get, and the question is whether you will take that return or something else. Okay. The risklessness was safe, so not quite effective. So direct lending. So far there are no banks. So direct lending.
Sorry.
Yes.
What is M specifically like?
N is the number of firms.
M.
N is, you should think of it as the number of lenders that you need to finance a single project.
Right.
You need 1 unit for the project. 1 over M is how much each of them has. So M times 1 over M will allow you to finance one project. Okay, so direct lending costs, well, N times M, which is the total number of lenders. Each of them has to spend K. So N times K. So direct lending, of course, works. But you don't want to use it because it is unlikely to be cost effective, as you will see now. A bank is an intermediary able to monitor all firms at cost N times K. So cheaper if M exceeds 1. So long as lenders are relatively small compared to the size of a firm, you'd rather use a bank. This much is clear. Okay. But as I said right at the beginning, who would monitor the bank? The bank ends up with the informational symmetry advantage now. So who monitors the bank? And if you think about it, this problem as to who monitors the monitor is a very general one. In any incentive problem, you will always have this sort of situation. You can figure out how to do the monitoring in a cheap, relatively cheap way, but then the question becomes, the party that's carrying out that monitoring ends up with the informational advantage. How do you provide that party with appropriate incentives? This is delegated monitoring. You have it in all sorts of Here it's a financial contract. Okay? So what we will use is a debt contract. It's a very special kind of contract, which I shall now try to explain. So what a debt contract does, and we'll come to it in a moment, we'll see how it works here. What is the nature of a debt contract? So a debt contract specifies states of nature. It specifies a payment that you will make. That's the promised payment, and that payment is the same across all states of nature. And there are states in which you declare bankruptcy. The question is, how do you specify the payment in those states so as to provide adequate incentives? Okay. It's quite a simple way of describing a debt contract. If you want to learn a little more about these things, the reading that you will do for this part is from a book by Freixas and Rocher, and that book has all sorts of discussions. It's a very well-written book on the microeconomics of banking, and they do have a separate section on debt contracts. If you are interested at all, you don't need to, but just to tell you that there is very good reading available for these things. You don't necessarily have to go to all the papers and read things in detail. The models, the way they're presented in the book, are actually very good. And for contracting in general, there's another book by someone called Salini, which is a very good book on contracting. Older books by Lafont, etc. That take us too far afield. Okay, so what is a debt contract? So over here, the idea is the lender deposits. This is just a bank deposit. 1 over M. So that's how much they have. They leave that with the bank and receives one of two. With N firms in the economy, there will be a certain rate of interest on the deposit contract, which is RND, times 1 over N. So I'm going to write that as RND over N. Or this will be deterministic. Okay, D stands for deposit, N stands for the size of the economy, how many firms. It will be deterministic, it has to be determined. Or Z tilde divided by Mn. Okay? Z tilde, which is less than or equal to RND over M, which is the random liquidation value the idea is that the bank says, look, I'm sorry, I promised this repayment to you, but we cannot make that, so we're just going to shut down, sell all our assets, and redistribute the assets uniformly across depositors, because over here every depositor is putting in the same amount, but you could also do it with different amounts of deposits. I'm sure you've come across examples in the news of organizations that have shut down. Administrators are called in, they decide what the assets and liabilities are, they decide whether it can be a going concern, etc., based on how much is owed performance. That's liquidation. And here's the problematic bit. We'll see why we need it. Just to say that this will be problematic. Cn is a non-pecuniary, so it's not in the form of a direct tangible economic benefit in terms of something that you can trade, is the way I would put it. Non-pecuniary or non-monetary penalty or cost that you will need to provide correct incentives. Needed to provide incentives, because otherwise the bank will lie. It will be will see what that quantity is. And send this to the bank. And then write all that. Questions so far? Anything that's not clear? All well?
Sorry, just the CN again, sorry.
Cn, you will see what it is. This is just the notation that we will use for an additional element that we will need in the model, and you'll see why, in order to make sure that the banks are truthful when they declare the liquidation value. That's what Cn. Yeah.
Is that saying less than sign? Less than
Yes.
Z
If when
just Z tilde is less than.
so what we are saying is if so to read, think of it in just in terms of converting this into plain English. This is what you've promised. If you can afford that, you pay that. If you cannot, then you will pay what you can by liquidating your organization. So that will come into play provided you cannot afford that. So this over here will be a strict inequality, but that's the situation in which that comes. Is that okay? Is there something that's still bothering you?
No, it's just the
Okay. Now you might also ask, why don't lenders write debt contracts directly with the firms? Okay, and that we're going to assume away by saying that K is less than C, where C, this is not Cn, it's C. C is the non-pecuniary cost to provide incentives for firms to be truthful bank signs a debt contract with the firm. So the bank can either monitor or sign a debt contract, and he's saying how it is. Of course, individual lenders could do the same. With individual lenders, we already know that each of them will separately pay the cost or the debt contract non-pecuniary cost. So either way, they will not want to do it. But what about the bank? Well, the bank will not do it because monitoring is costly. Okay. So the bank prefers to. So banks monitor firms. Okay. And throughout, we're basically working with m larger than 1. Because it did some point. Now, of course, Z tilde is the declared value. Okay? So, to induce truthful behavior, so you want the banks to be truthful vis-a-vis, the banks already know what the firm's output actually is because the banks are monitoring. That's the assumption so far. To induce truthful behavior, this declared value, the liquidation value, should be equal to sum I from 1 to n y tilde I, which is a random variable, minus n times k, which you know is the cost that they bear because they're monitoring. So now, if the bank is truthful, depositors receive depositor. I'm not going to write this. Let's not write it directly. So it receives what? Well, as we've said, if it's truthful, then Z tilde will be the liquidation value. So the depositor will receive the smaller, because we already said that earlier, of, written this before, sum 1 to n y tilde I minus nk divided through by the total number of depositors, which is n times n, or the promised amount. We still don't know what the promised amount is. Okay, we need to determine it. We're going to see how it works. The promised amount is Rnd times 1 over n. The smaller of these two. Okay? However, that term is of course a random variable. Each firm has an IID draw for its output. So what the bank actually receives, even if it declares truthfully, it's going to be a random variable. So you have its expectation. Is it okay? Okay, good.
I'm not really seeing how, like, this is pushing the bank to be truthful, if that makes
You
sense.
haven't seen that so far. That we still haven't said. We're saying if it's truthful, that's important, we'll get to that. If it's truthful, then what the depositor will receive is that expectation. Right? Remember, as in any micro problem, typically, we specify what a person's constraints are and then the person chooses. And based on those choices, we determine what is equilibrium behavior. We're doing the same here. So suppose you know what RND is, and suppose the bank is truthful, what will the depositor get? Well, that's what the depositor gets, an expected value. Why do we need that? Well, because the depositor's alternative use of funds is a riskless technology.
Is the depositor aware of the distribution of Y? To know, like,
The contract will make sure that it provides a great incentive. That's where Cn will come in. Okay? So R divided by M, because R times 1 over M is what you would get if you go with the riskless technology. Right? Those are your two options. You can think of this, there are no derivatives here. You can think of it as the first order. It's a no arbitrage. So the return of the two activities has to be the same. Is it okay? So if the depositor is truthful, then the depositor receives what is on the right hand side, which has to be equal to, so we write it on a separate line so that you don't get equals R over M in equilibrium. Right. Now, here's the key. So this is the punch line, and then we proceed from there. So now, when will the bank be truthful? So here's where the nature of the contract comes in, and we specify things a little better. Right? So of course, if the liquidation value is higher than the promised payment, then the bank simply pays the promised payment. So if being truthful what it needs to pay exceeds N RND. So if it can afford it based on the resources that it already has, and it's being truthful. So the resources that it already has tells you it can afford it. Okay? We assume it's being truthful, and therefore, in that sense, depositors also know that. Doesn't really matter here. Okay? Then, as I said, it can afford to. Then it pays in R&D, and you don't need any further incentives.
strict inequality?
It's a strict inequality here. Now here's the crunch. Look at the if instead here I'm putting in the inequality. Now what? So that's how much it's required to pay. That's the promise required in that sense. That's what's on the contract. Okay? Now suppose in this situation, the bank actually pays less than n times Rn in aggregate. Suppose. So what we are saying is it does not have enough. Now suppose it were to be the case that when it does not have enough, it actually pays less. Now you, it has less, so you say, okay, fine, if it has less, it has to pay less. If it were to pay less, what would happen? Think of situations in which the outcome is such that it's actually in that contingency. Okay, so now think of two contingencies. In one, it's paying n times RND. In another, it's paying less than n times RND. Right? Depositors don't know any better. If you were the bank, what would you say? You would always claim that you're in the worst of the two situations. Do you agree? Right? Depositors have no way of knowing. They know the distribution, but they don't know what really happened. So if the contract says, okay, sometimes I give you 5, sometimes I give you 3, if you as a depositor were to sign that contract, you would always get 3. You're never going to get 5. You agree? Scamsters. And that's what a scamster does. Whether you call it a bank or anybody, it doesn't matter. The person will come to you and say, thank you very much for giving me the money, but you know what? This terrible day, there's a problem with the harvest. Iran attack, Trump attack, who knows what. Give you some story because you can't verify it. Which means what? Yeah? If instead, then, so what we're saying is, by incentive compatibility, something that I haven't really defined, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. I haven't really fully defined the game or anything like that. Therefore, I'm not going to define it any further. By incentive compatibility, again, the payment must be and here's where the catch is, of course. So what we are saying is that regardless, the bank must make the same payment in every state of nature. How do you do that? You don't have the resources. So this is where you have the non-pecuniary cost. You say that the bank will face this cost. Okay, this you will have to, it's very easy to check, but you will have to check this on the problem set. Okay. Yes. Problem set 7. C tilde n. This is random. It has to be random because the amount of shortfall will depend upon what actually happened to all the firms. Right? You're talking about the difference between these two. I haven't written it, but you'll see that in a moment. So it has to be random. So C tilde n will actually be equal to the larger of y. Because we know that there are situations in which you will not have to pay anything. Use the notation that I have used. It's actually very easy to check this. You will have to do that. So there will be some situations in which what it costs you, right, in terms of the deposit, interest rate together with the monitoring costs over and above what you're recovering by monitoring all the firms. When that amount is positive, then that amount is said to be C tilde n, because with that value of C tilde n, it will be the case that even in situations in which were the bank to be truthful, you would not be able to cover the promised repayment. Okay. However, including that additional factor, you are able to make sure that it's always n times R&D, which is what the bank pays. So what we are saying is this is a cost to the bank. It's on the bank's books. So this is a reputational cost. More than the bank, in terms of a one-period problem, the bank does not have the resources to do this. This is clear. It can. Okay? This is why it's called a non-pecuniary cost. In some sense, this is a nice way to approach the problem, but it also has its problems. Because if you want to do it correctly, you would want to do it in a multi-period framework. And this is not my area of research. I have to tell you, I don't know that that has been done by anyone. But at least I haven't heard of. Okay? So, C tilde n is what you would get, and Cn will be the expectation of C tilde n, which you get from the expression that we have. So that's your actual non-pecuniary cost if you have any of this. And now I'm going to state the result and indicate how you would go around. Questions so far? You still haven't stated the result. Yeah. Something bothering you.
When we say they pay the cost through non-pecuniary means, it's
Yeah.
like a reputation error. When they,
It's on the balance sheet.
it's on the balance sheet, so they don't just give you the 3 instead of the 5 and say, sorry, we're not good for your money. And then that's
No. Yeah, okay, so careful. What the depositor receives is actually 3. The depositor cannot receive more.
Yeah.
Correct? But the bank, in order to make sure that it's truthful, the bank suffers a penalty which appears on its balance sheet. That penalty will ensure that from the bank's perspective, it's making the same payment. Because otherwise, the bank would lie.
So, all right, so the other person is like, oh, okay, we got the 3 because we got the 3, even though we were supposed to be
Correct.
For the bank, they're like, oh my goodness gracious, this is terrible. But they can't say that to someone else. It's just
No, they do say it to somebody else.
They do.
No, that's the point. That's exactly the point. You see, any reasonable depositor will say, okay, fine, I'm a small depositor, it looks like I'm not bearing any risk, but that's because I'm going through the bank. At the end of the day, the bank is bearing the risk on my behalf. So there will be situations in which it'll be bad for me. I just want to make sure that the bank is not telling me it's always bad. Correct? Because otherwise, if you don't provide these incentives, the bank will always claim it's 3. That you don't want. So when it's 3, you will get 3. But this appears on the bank's balance sheet to make sure that it does not claim it's 3 when it's actually 5. Yeah.
How is the bank sort of observing and internalizing the costs and the benefits to itself? What's actually does it have a utility function over what's happening, or is it just I don't know. I'm kind of struggling to see how we're we're going to get the bank to sort of behave in a certain way when we've not really said, we've not explicitly outlined how the bank interacts with information that it's being given.
Well, okay. So the information that is given to depositors doesn't really matter because it's going to be there.
Yeah.
The only information that's relevant is for the firms.
Yeah, no, but it's also relevant, for the cost to be effective, it needs to be relevant to the bank.
But it's not. It's not relevant to the depositor. It's relevant in terms of the interaction with firms, but there it's paying the monitoring cost, okay, right, per firm.
Yeah.
So it knows what the output is. And then what you are saying is that there has to be this additional element in the contract to make sure that the bank is truthful vis-a-vis the lenders.
Yeah.
That's what we're saying.
But there also needs to be the bank needs to care about its cost.
These models would typically say that, okay, if there's any problem with any of that, you say that there is competition amongst banks and their profit is zero. The point is you need the non-pecuniary cost. Without that, things will not work.
Yeah, but why do they care about the non-pecuniary cost?
Because otherwise they will not have any customers. Which
Yeah,
customer will go to a bank?
To what extent can they tolerate some level of, because you
They cannot.
they can't tolerate any.
Well, you tell me. If you know that the bank that you leave your money with will always lie to you, you go to the bank.
That, like, let's say that they miss some of their repayments or whatever, and they accrue some non-pecuniary cost, and there must be a tolerable margin for the bank, surely.
No, but this is from the customer's point of view. If the customer knows that the contract that they're facing is one where they will always get taken for a ride, they will go to a different bank.
How many banks are we assuming there are?
What I'm saying is, think of it as a comparative story. You will always have some other bank which can come in. Any bank that has, basically the point is the following. If you don't have the non-pecuniary cost, every customer will see that bank as a bad bank.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you have some other bank or not, this is a separate matter. You will not leave your money with that bank.
So depositors will exclusively leave their money with banks with zero non-pecuniary cost?
No. Depositors will leave their money with banks that do suffer a pecuniary cost, a non-pecuniary cost, okay, of the correct amount.
Because the non-pecuniary cost is theirs,
That's why, because without that, they know that the bank will lie.
they're bearing it.
Oh,
They're
right,
lying.
okay, okay.
The depositor knows that there will be situations in which they will get less back. That they know.
Right.
What they want to make sure is that they will never get anything. Think about it.
Right.
I'm taking it to the extreme where the bank always thinks that everybody got a zero. It's not like that. But if you don't know better, that's what incentive did the bank have. As I said, think about scammers. Right? They'll always tell you that it's just this time it happened. But you think about it, and different people will tell you it happened to me as well. It happened to me. It's telling you it happens always. And this much customer would know. Is it okay? All right, everyone? Yeah? Okay. So now what's the result? Okay. So when are we going to see delegated monitoring? This is what we've been describing. Okay, think in terms of efficiency. When will you see delegated monitoring? Well, when it costs less. So delegated monitoring versus direct lending. You want to write this in a manner that is a bit better, but perhaps in the notes it's written better. So n times k is the monitoring cost, plus Cn is the total cost to provide incentives. If that is less than n times k, right? Which is if there's direct monitoring of firms by the lenders. So you want to see when this is true. When is it that you will see delegated monitoring as appearing because it's socially useful? This is what we're asking. So from here, you notice that if you divide through by n, okay, then it suffices that Cn over n goes to 0, let n large enough. You want to show, you want to check under what conditions it is the case that this non-pecuniary cost relative to the size of the economy vanishes. When will that happen? If that happens, efficiency indicates that you should see delegated monitoring, and therefore it's an institution that you might expect to come over. Okay? So, let's see if we can do a little more than this. Actually, we're almost there. So what's the result? This is the main result. Assume things that we already assumed. Okay, I just erased it, but assume that K is less than C. Okay, so this was whether or not firms and banks would write contracts rather than monitor, and we said no, they would rather monitor. M is larger than 1, so depositors are small, which I've been saying right from the beginning. and investment is profitable. In what sense? Well, the expected return is at least as high as K plus R. So R is your alternative safe investment return. K is your cost of monitoring. So you would want investment to be profitable. Okay. If N is large enough, then Cn over N approaches 0 as N goes to infinity. So if there is diversification, all is well. You can diversify away risk. Everything is fine. Okay. So very quick, how does it work? Okay, so the details are in Robinson 7. So what's the idea? So the idea is you need to use strong law of large numbers, right? There's law of large numbers. There's the weak law and the strong law. I'll get into all this when we do the problem solving session. So your average realization will approach the expected value. Yes, we know that. Right? Remember, a realization in this economy is a value for each firm. Okay? So the average of that is one realization. As you look at different realizations of the economy, so that's a value for each firm, and you look at different realizations, across them with probability 1, you will get that result. That's what law of large numbers is. I'll be more specific about this, as I said, when we do the problem solving session. Okay? So, when we look over here, this part, right, this is inside the expectation. You need to be careful here. There's a bit, that's a bit tricky.